It was finally cold enough to skate on the ice. Emily looked forward to this time of year. She always had. She figured she'd start early on the ice before Miss Elise started their skate sessions. Miss Elise was a great teacher, but she was mean. Emily's mother once told her, "Oftentimes great teachers aren't very personable." Her mother grew up with a piano teacher that would whack her hands when she hit the wrong notes, but she played the piano beautifully. Emily didn't really understand why Miss Elise had to be so mean, but the beauty of her mother's elegant piano playing inspired her to deal with her teacher frequently berating and belittling her. The air was crisp. It was cold, but there was no breeze, save the air rushing past as she skated. A few others seized this opportunity at an early skate as well. Soon, the rink would be bustling with people. This pond was the centerpiece to the town's holiday season. Lights would soon be strung up on every tree around it, and the deeper into December it got, the more the pond would be flooded with families, kids, teenagers, and holiday cheer. A few days before Christmas, there would be the Christmas jamboree, at which Emily and her classmates would again be doing a synchronized skate routine, choreographed by Miss Elise. Last year went really well, with the exception of Tabitha's performance. It might have been the pressure, or maybe the ice was particularly slick that day, but she fell. She started off decent enough, but once she fell, she lost her footing and started skating off in the wrong direction. She was nice, though. Emily didn't really know her aside from dance class, but she liked her attitude and pep. This year would be weird without her. She went missing earlier that year, just as winter was ending. Once a week, one of the girls would stay after for something Miss Elise called extended dance. It was a scheduled thing. There were 7 girls, and Emily's day was Tuesday. Tabitha's day was Wednesday. Tabitha's parents came to pick her up that night, and Miss Elise informed them that she had opted to walk home. She never came home. "Emily!" a voice shouted from the side of the pond. It was Emily's friend, Keisha. Emily skated over to her. "Hey, Keish, you come to skate?" Keisha looked surprised. "Huh, I don't think so. Today was rough enough without me busting my ass on Swan Lake." Emily smirked and rolled her eyes. "Then why'd you come down here?" Keisha tilted her head forward and raised her eyebrows. "I'm still waiting to be asked out to winter nights. Just because school's over doesn't mean my chances for finding Prince Charming are." Emily looked around. "There aren't exactly a lot of people out here yet." Keisha nodded and pursed her lips. "Yeah, I can see that. I thought a few more people would be down here, you know? Early bird gets the worm, but I guess I was wrong about that. Shouldn't you be at dance anyway?" "Nah, not today. My teacher's getting things ready for our skate sessions. When it gets to be this time of year, we transition to lessons on the ice. Good luck finding your Prince Charming. I think I'm going to call it a day." Emily skated over to her bag and changed into her shoes. The pond was nestled in the woods, past a park on the edge of town. There were already a few illuminated trees and decorations up as she walked back to the main path that would bring her to the park. From the park, her house wasn't far. Her parents would probably be home soon if they weren't already, and she worked up an appetite from skating. School whizzed by the next day. Emily was smart. She didn't have to try too hard, and for the most part, her classes bored her. After school, she rode the bus to a stop that was right in front of the park on the edge of town. She got off and made the walk through the short bit of woods to the pond. Miss Elise and her dance mates were all there, laced up and on the ice already. "Nice of you to join us, Miss Emily," Miss Elise called out. "Put on your skates and come at once." "No, for your tardiness, do 3 laps, and then join us." Emily let out a long breath, concealing her frustration. After her lap, she skated into the circle her dance mates were huddled in. One of the other girls was just landing from a jump. "No, no, no, no," Miss Elise yelled out. "Your form is all wrong, and your feet are hitting the ice at 2 different times." Emily could already tell that she was frustrated. The first day of skate was always grueling, and it didn't get much better from there. Miss Elise scanned the girls and landed on Emily. "You, show them a proper jump." Emily had already anticipated this, having practiced the day before, and executed a perfect jump. Miss Elise frowned. "Not terrible, but don't stick your hands out so much on the landing." Emily felt a strong sense of accomplishment from that. She liked skating, maybe even more than dancing. If there had been a rink anywhere in town, she'd probably be a regular. There was a roller skating rink, but that just wasn't the same. Miss Elise flung her head sideways, signaling Emily to join back with the ranks. "This year will not be the same as last year. Our embarrassment will not be repeated." Emily didn't really understand why Miss Elise was so hell-bent on making sure everything went off without a hitch, but then she remembered her mother's anecdotes about great teachers. Their practice went on, with more unrelenting scrutiny from Miss Elise. Emily and the other girls skated on, the late afternoon waning. Eventually it came to an end, and the girls walked down the path along with the others that were leaving the pond for the day. Emily wanted to stay one step ahead of Miss Elise. She knew she was doing well, but wanted to do even better. She was also still captivated by the fresh ice and felt a pull to it. After she ate dinner and finished her homework, Emily wanted to go back to the ice. She asked her mother, and after some convincing, she agreed. The rink wasn't too far from her house, and Emily was old enough to manage on her own. Plus, this time of year, her parents were sure the rink would be populated with plenty of people. Be home by 9, it's a school night. The 6 months or so after Tabitha's disappearance, this would have been an impossible request. But her parents were starting to loosen their grip on her independence a bit more now that some time had passed. Emily's father chimed in. "I'll drop you off. It'll give you a little more time on the ice." Emily knew the real reason her dad wanted to drop her off, but she entertained him anyway. "You're right, Pop. Good idea." When they pulled up to the park entrance, they saw groups of people making their way to the path that led to the pond. "I can come pick you up here at 9 if you want," her father asked. "That sounds good," Emily replied as she opened the car door and stepped out. "Don't worry, Dad. I'm sure there'll be mobs of people out here." Her dad looked at her for a moment and smiled. "I know, Emily. Have fun." She made her way over to the path. Music was playing a ways off, closer to the ice, and she could see lights flickering in the distance, too. She kept her hands in her coat pockets as she walked. Seeing her breath in the air was a reminder of the cold winter months yet to come. It was darker now, and as she walked along the path, Emily could see more of the lights strung up in the trees. The holiday music was getting louder, too. It was probably coming from the food truck that was set up this time of year. It had chocolate and sweets and a few other small snacks. There'd be more trucks as the season went on. Most of the trees were big pines and had a small layer of fresh white snow on them from the night before. People in Minnesota have a high tolerance for winter. It was winter for what felt like over half of the year, most years. The land of 10,000 lakes and probably at least a few hundred holiday ponds. When Emily got to the pond, she was surprised. There were fewer people there than she'd anticipated. Still a fair amount, but not as many as she'd expected. With the music, lights, and sparse groups of people, it felt like a dream. She didn't have the pond to herself, but there were big patches of it that didn't seem like they'd been touched all day. There was a certain number of people the city deemed safe to be on the ice at once, but no one really kept track of that number. Once it got closer to the jamboree, a few people would go out and scrape the top of the ice with snow shovels to smooth it out a bit, but during these earlier days leading up to that, it could get a little bumpy out there if you weren't careful. Emily strapped on her skates and stepped onto the ice. She glided a ways out and then did a jump. Her green wool coat was warm, but she buttoned it to keep in some more of her body heat. It was calm and peaceful. Most of the people that were there were hanging out by the, quote, entrance of the pond. There wasn't technically an entrance you could get on from anywhere, but there was one spot most people set off from. Emily's plan was to skate a ways out from there and practice. The ice would be smoother, and she wouldn't have to worry about colliding with anyone. The blades of her skates were cutting fresh lines in the ice as she reached the other side of the pond. She could still hear the Christmas music, but it was a bit more faint now. There were dim pole lights speckled around the perimeter of the pond, an addition the city had made a few years ago. As she practiced a few jumps and spins, she felt a sense of calmness and stillness wash over her. There was something sacred about getting into a flow state for her, something that allowed the stress and anxiety to fall from her. Dancing and skating were forms of meditation. She wasn't thinking about AP biology, her chores, or what she was going to wear to winter nights, if anyone asked her to go. She was focused on the movement of her body. Emily landed an axel, a move she'd been working on with hopes of impressing Miss Elise and the crowd at the jamboree. As she landed, the air rushed past her, and she felt the calming effect of the flow state once again. She closed her eyes and glided for a moment. When she opened them, she noticed someone standing, not far, at the edge of the pond. She hadn't noticed them before, and a chill ran through her body. Probably just from the cold, she thought. They were standing under a tree by the tree line at the edge of the pond. Light from one of the pole lights was faintly illuminating them. Their red hat was striking against the white snow, and they wore a coat that looked similar to Emily's, only it was a dark burgundy color. How long had they been standing there? Emily thought. "Hey there," she called out. As she skated closer, she could tell that the person was a girl, probably around her age. The closer she got, the more she could make out. She squinted her eyes and leaned her head forward in an effort to focus. Emily's expression changed from curiosity to utter shock. The girl's skin was a pale blue, and she had ice clumps hanging from her long black hair. She was staring at Emily, blankly. It was Tabitha. "Oh my God, Tabitha!" Emily cried out. Realizing who the person was, she skated towards her as fast as she could. The cold air again rushed past her. As she approached, she could see Tabitha's dark brown eyes reflecting light from the pole's lantern above. Emily reached the edge of the pond, but Tabitha vanished. She dissipated into the evening air, just like Emily's warm breath in front of her. The dreaminess of the pond now felt like a nightmare to her. She was breathing heavily and watching as the vapors that had once been Tabitha's form floated away. What was that? She thought. No one else around the pond seemed to notice. The music was still playing and people were still talking and laughing at the other end. She felt cold now. A real cold. She decided that her skating practice was over for the evening. The cup of hot chocolate from the food truck warmed her up a bit. There were still 20 minutes before her dad would be there to pick her up. She walked down the path of pines that connected the pond to the park and tried to make sense of what she'd just seen. Was it a ghost? She thought. Emily had never really considered the possibility of ghosts existing before. She had read about ghostly encounters and seen them in the movies, but they always seemed like something that existed only there to her, for entertainment. What she saw was too vivid to be her imagination, but she was sure that no one would believe her if she told them what she'd seen. She wasn't so sure she believed it herself. The next day after school, it was back to the ice with her class and Miss Elise. She thought her axle still felt a bit shaky to debut it, so she went through the motions of Miss Elise's choreography with the rest of the girls. "No, you start the spin on the left and pull to the right after landing." There was a dense cloud of breath in front of Miss Elise after her shouting. The girls were breathing heavily. Some of Miss Elise's drills were meant more for pro ice skaters than high school dancers. Emily tried to keep her mind on the ice. She glanced over to the area she had skated in the night before, not knowing if she actually wanted to see Tabitha's figure there or not. Practice eventually ended, and Miss Elise yelled out, as she did when things came to a close, "Dismissed!" The girls visibly relaxed and began skating to the entrance of the pond. Keisha walked over to Emily as she was taking off her skates. "Back at it again. Seems like all you do is practice." Emily looked up to her, continuing to untie her skate. "I like it, and it's good exercise." Keisha raised an eyebrow and nodded her chin in the direction of Miss Elise, who was now exiting the ice. "And it seems like you're in good company, too." Emily glanced over to Miss Elise. "She's pretty mean. I put up with it, but honestly I wish you were a bit more chill." Keisha smirked at Emily and looked at her with pity. "Was that a joke?" Emily, not realizing the pun she'd just made, replied, "I wish it was." She paused for a minute and thought, then said, "Hey, can I ask you a question? It's kind of weird." Keisha gave her a few quick nods and narrowed her eyes, as if to say, "Ask away." Emily looked around and lowered her voice. "Do you believe in ghosts?" Keisha looked at her for a moment and then nodded slowly. "I've seen one. After my grandma passed a few years ago, I saw her out back once. She was wearing a pair of jumpers she always wore, and she was watering the garden. My brother never believed me, but I swear, hand to God, I saw her." "What do you think she wanted?" Emily asked. "I don't know, but I read up on it, and from what I could find, usually ghosts have something they need to tell you or something they need you to do. My grandma didn't get to say goodbye to me, and I really just think she needed to before she could pass on. I don't think it's like the movies. Ghosts don't show up and try to scare you or appear as weird creatures or anything. I think they're just kind of lost." Emily looked into Keisha's eyes and said, "I'm sorry about your grandma." Keisha looked down and nodded as she bit her bottom lip. "I know you're out here probably looking for Prince Charming, but can I buy you a cup of hot chocolate?" "Call me crazy, but I'm not a big fan of hot chocolate," Keisha replied. But I do like the spiced cider they have." They were both walking along the connecting path, sipping their drinks and looking out into the pine trees. Without looking at Keisha, Emily asked, "Do you ever think about Tabitha?" Keisha paused for a moment. "I think we all do. I remember my mom not letting me go anywhere alone for months after what happened. I didn't really know her, but I feel like everyone in the town was affected by her disappearance. I just feel bad for her parents. People say they're still looking for her. They won't give up. How could you, though, you know? I probably never could." "Me neither," Emily replied. Then they were silent for a few steps. They could hear the distant sound of Christmas music and skaters on the pond. The sound of crunching snow underneath their shoes mingled with it. Emily exhaled and mustered the courage to say what she'd been meaning to say. "I saw Tabitha." Keisha stopped and looked at Emily. She looked back. "You what?" she asked in disbelief. "Like how you saw your grandma. I saw Tabitha by the ice yesterday. I tried to skate to her and she disappeared. She looked dead. Her hair had lumps of ice in it and her skin looked frozen." Emily went on to explain the rest of the encounter, and Keisha, having had her own experience with things she didn't entirely understand, understood. The next day on the ice was another grueling one. Miss Elise seemed to be even more frustrated than usual. After the practice and Miss Elise's dismissal, Emily decided to skate around for a bit. It was their last day of school. Christmas break had officially begun, and the next 2 weeks were hers. There were more people on the ice now, and a second food truck had appeared. Emily glided past groups of other skaters and looked out along the edge of the pond. She couldn't stop thinking about Tabitha. Looking out to the area where her encounter with her had been, she spotted Miss Elise skating alone. She was looking down and skating slowly. For a moment, Emily felt sorry for her. She probably didn't have any friends, certainly not a boyfriend. Emily thought, maybe she was a widow. Miss Elise looked up and noticed Emily looking at her. Emily turned away quickly and skated off in the opposite direction, hoping she hadn't noticed. Emily was a good kid. She was studious and didn't get into much trouble, but every once in a while, she broke the rules. Never anything harmful or malicious, just small things. Tonight, she was planning one of those small things. After dinner, and after her parents went to bed, she planned to go back to the ice. Late. To her, night skates were the best. No one would be at the pond, and they left the Christmas lights on leading up to the jamboree. She knew because this wasn't her first season sneaking out to the pond. There was the matter of Tabitha, though. Emily felt curious rather than afraid. She thought, maybe Tabitha needed to say something, like Keisha's grandma. Emily wondered why she showed up at the pond, though. That part didn't make sense to her. The moon shimmered off the surface of the ice as Emily skated. Without the Christmas music and the people, she could hear her skates cutting through the ice as she moved. The lights in the distance by the entrance of the pond reflected dimly on the surface. That feeling of meditation came to Emily again. She began to hum and match the resonance of her skates on the ice. This was a perfect time to practice the axel. She sped up and crouched, then leapt into the air, executed it, and landed. "Yes," she whispered to herself. She turned on the ice to make her way back to the lights, and as she did, she saw her. Tabitha was standing a few yards in front of her on the ice. Emily stopped and stared at her. Tabitha didn't move. She just stared back. Her skin in the darkness was so pale that it looked as though it were glowing. Her dark eyes looked completely black. Emily called out, "Do you need to say goodbye?" Tabitha continued to stare at her. Emily skated slowly closer to her. "What happened to you?" Tabitha began to twitch, as someone does when they're very cold. She extended her pale hand to Emily. Emily reached out and touched it. A waterfall of images and emotions flowed into her. They were of Tabitha dancing and laughing, then of her falling on ice. Shame poured from the fountain of emotions, and then fear. Emily could hear Miss Elise's voice yelling. Then there were flashes of red and green mixed with the sound of screaming. Emily's vision showed her warm, steaming blood trickling down a wall of ice. She then heard Tabitha screaming out, "No, please, no!" Then everything went black. Emily awoke from the vision. Tabitha was still standing in front of her. Her hand extended. Then, very quickly, she sat on the ice. Her head was resting on the tops of her knees, and she was looking down at the ice. Emily's eyes widened as the ice around her began to glow, a deep red. A hole opened beneath her, and fog poured out. The water, where the ice had been, was bubbling, and Tabitha was sitting on it. The red was bouncing off of Emily's face. She couldn't move. Tabitha looked up from her knees. She now had one visibly black eye, and a few beads of blood were falling down her face from the top of her head. The water continued to bubble as Tabitha's body descended into it, slowly. Her black eyes stared, fixed on Emily, until her head was completely under. The red light faded and the hole in the ice closed up, leaving no trace behind. The next morning, Emily stared into her bowl of cereal, toying with her spoon. Her parents were at work, and she had no idea what she was going to do with herself that day. The encounter with Tabitha was strange to her. She didn't feel afraid. More than anything, she just wanted answers. Why was Miss Elise screaming in the visions Tabitha showed me? She thought. She remembered what Keisha had said about ghosts, needing to tell you something or do something. Relief about being on holiday break washed over her. She'd be in trigonometry right now, and there was no way she could have focused on anything like that. Finishing up her bowl of cereal, she made up her mind. She was going to ask Miss Elise about Tabitha after practice today. The angle of your skates matters, ladies. Not just to me, it will matter to everyone watching, Miss Elise shouted. Emily, along with the rest of the girls, really didn't think it would. Dismissed. The girls again returned to their more comfortable postures and skated to the edge of the ice, happy to be out of the clutches of Miss Elise. Emily followed behind them. She knew that after practice Miss Elise liked to skate off onto a different part of the ice, away from other people. A patrol of sorts, or perhaps she too felt the meditation flow state. Emily didn't much care about why she went out there, but she would be going out there to ask her questions. Miss Elise did go out to the other side of the pond. She was skating a long, drawn-out figure eight when Emily approached. Emily, not wanting to disrupt the flow of Miss Elise's eight, started to skate in a circle around it, just behind her. I'm excited for the jamboree. Are you excited, Miss Elise? She grunted her reply, and it was just that, a short, annoyed grunt. Emily could see this wasn't going to be something she could ease into. Talking to Miss Elise was like talking to a wall. A cold, angry wall. So she decided to cut to the chase. Do you ever think about Tabitha? It's so strange how she just disappeared, and we've never really talked about it in class, and you... Miss Elise stopped making her figure eight, and Emily stopped as well. Miss Elise turned to her slowly. It's unfortunate. Sometimes people just... She opened her hand, one finger at a time. Disappear. Then she turned and skated off. That wasn't good enough for Emily. That night, she broke the rules again. Emily went out for another late-night skate. Like a corny movie, she snuck out through her window under the light of the moon. It had snowed quite a bit after practice, and there were still some small flurries wafting through the air. The snow made it feel lighter than it was. The streetlights on the way to the park glistened off the falling snow and reflected off the ice that was starting to form on car windshields. A plow went by a bend in the road that ran along the edge of the park and cleared it a bit, sprinkling out salt crystals from behind. You didn't have to walk through too much of the park to get to the entrance of the path that connected it to the pond, but with the fresh snow, it took Emily a little longer than usual. It probably would have taken her even more time, too, if it weren't for the mobs of people leaving the ice earlier, tamping down a small path. She reached the walkway to the pond. The snow on the pines was fresh, and the way the lights bounced off it was beautiful to her. Each small, strung-up bulb had an aura that reflected onto the snow around it. Some of the bulbs were just below the snow, on the branches, and she could see them glowing from beneath. No one was on the path, and she could hear the crunch of snow beneath her boots. The trees closest to the path were decorated, but there were rows and rows of pines and other trees that stretched to the left and right of her. She looked out through the forest corridors. A ways off, she saw movement. Maybe a deer, she thought. A shadow was moving from tree to tree. Emily stopped to watch. The shadow moved with a quickness that seemed unnatural to her. It bounced from one tree to the next. Suddenly, it started moving very quickly, back and forth. It was getting closer. Then it stopped. The still lights in the trees began to twinkle. Emily began to look around. Like the movement in the trees, they too were increasing in speed. At first, it was a slow shift of balanced speckling. The lights would go bright and then fade. But soon, the flickering turned to a rapid pace and shifted very quickly. From her periphery, Emily saw movement again. This time it was very close. From the tree line, right beside the path, she saw a red, knitted hat start to emerge from behind one of the pines. Then a face. It was Tabitha. Her black eyes reflected the rapid shifting of the lights as she extended her hand. Emily wasn't afraid. She took it. More visions flooded her mind, visions again of pain and fear. Some kind of lid slammed on Tabitha. She felt small Christmas light bulbs cracking all around her. It wasn't her pain, but she felt it. A stiff blow to the head. Then she saw Tabitha's reflection in the mirrors of the dance studio, the way she appeared now, frozen and with an essence of death about her. Then she saw more steaming blood dripping down ice. A weight was pulling her down, and she felt cold, so cold. Everything went black, and she could hear the muffled screaming voice of Miss Elise. When she opened her eyes, Tabitha was gone. Emily still went to the pond and skated. There was a lot to think about. She knew what needed to be done, but she would have to be very careful about how she did it. If she confronted Miss Elise directly, she could wind up like Tabitha. A few more days of winter break passed, along with a few more days of agonizing skate practice. Emily decided that she was going to debut her axle jump at the Christmas jamboree without telling Miss Elise. She also decided that after her jump, that's when she'd tell the town about what happened to Tabitha. It would all be out in the open, and Miss Elise couldn't deny anything. She and the other girls would also be safe. Winter nights came and went. Keisha found her Prince Charming, and a few boys had asked Emily to go, but her mind was elsewhere. Her parents noticed, but Emily told them that she wanted to focus on nailing the skate routine. Primping and preparing for a dance weren't things she wanted to spend the mental energy on. That part wasn't actually a lie, just not the entire picture. The day of the jamboree came. It felt like the whole town was there at the pond. Emily had been back to the ice since her last encounter with Tabitha, but Tabitha hadn't shown herself. Emily guessed it was because she'd already told her everything she needed to know. The decorations were extravagant. Every tree surrounding the pond was strung up with lights now. There were several speakers mounted along the pond playing chipper Christmas songs. 4 food trucks were in attendance, and there was even a vendor that was there selling light-up trinkets for kids. Families were skating along the ice, along with couples holding hands. There were layers of laughter and yelling in the air. A snowball fight broke out close to the entrance of the pond, and an older man got caught in the crossfire. "I didn't want to have to, but you've given me no choice," he yelled out as he bent to scoop up an artillery shell of snow. Tabitha's family was there too. Their therapist told them it would be productive to go and support their daughter's dance class on the ice. It was hard to see them. They were smiling, but they were the type of smiles that held back deep sadness. Expressions that just sat on the surface, like a cheap plastic mask. Emily and her class were out on the ice. They were all wearing matching burgundy coats and hats, the same deep burgundy of Tabitha's coat. Miss Elise sat at the edge of the ice, staring off across the pond. It was early evening, and the sun hadn't quite fully set yet. The lights in the trees were becoming more vibrant as it did, and the pole lights around the pond would be kicking on soon. Just then, the Christmas music faded. A warm voice came on. "Ladies and gentlemen, first and foremost, thank you so much for joining us in celebrating this year's Christmas Jamboree. Let's give a round of applause to everyone who made this beautiful night happen." Hands clapped, and cheers and whistles reverberated through the air. We're just getting started this evening, and I'd like to ask everyone to clear the ice for a few minutes while we're treated to a very special ice skating routine that's been choreographed by the incomparable Miss Elise and executed by her brilliant dance team." That word, executed, made Emily wince. There was a brief applause, and the other skaters exited the pond. The girls took up their formation, and the song they'd decided to do their routine to started playing from the speakers. Emily was nervous, not about the routine, but about what she had to do afterwards. She thought for a moment, considering her options, but decided there were none. This was the only way. Miss Elise stood as stiff as a board and stared out at them. Once the music started, she moved her hands through the air, instructing the girls like a maestro conducts an orchestra. Her scowl was cold, and her upper lip twitched upward on one side of her mouth. The girls went through their routine seamlessly, receiving several whoops and wows from the crowd. The music and the routine were coming to an end. It was time for Emily's axel. She broke formation, and Miss Elise's hands stopped in the air. Anger washed over her face. Her outstretched hands closed into fists. The music crescendoed, and Emily leapt into the air, her secret grand finale. The music ended, and Emily fell to the ice. There was a gash in the ice she hadn't anticipated right at the bottom of her landing area. The crowd breathed in, audibly. Emily stood up and brushed herself off. There was an applause at this, not a roaring, thunderous one, but an applause. Miss Elise took a step onto the ice. "That wasn't part of the routine, you little twit, and now you've embarrassed us in front of the entire town. Are you happy now? Your little jump—" Emily cut her off. "Of course I'm not happy. You shouldn't be happy either, you bitch." The crowd gasped at this. Emily surprised herself as well, but continued. "You're just out here, acting like nothing happened, like a monster. Your heart's evil, Miss Elise. I don't know who hurt you or why you're the way that you are, but it doesn't give you any excuse to do what you did to Tabitha." Several eyes moved from Emily to Miss Elise, including the eyes of Tabitha's parents. "Your perfectionism really led you to killing someone? And how do you live with yourself? How do you sleep at night, knowing what you did?" The eyes that were on Miss Elise were now curious and confused. The crowd was very quiet now. Emily didn't need to yell. She skated closer to Miss Elise and looked into her eyes. "I know you were mad about Tabitha's fall last year, mad enough to bash her in the head and then tie her up with Christmas lights you kept in the storage room at the studio." The energy of the crowd was palpable. The tension in the air was thicker than the ice on the pond. Miss Elise looked left to right, frantically. The eyes of the crowd were piercing her. Emily let out a long, slow breath. It floated in the air. This last question was one she didn't know the answer to. She thought she might, but she needed to hear it from Miss Elise's lips. Was she still alive when you weighed her down and put her in the pond? Miss Elise's eyes widened and her entire mouth was twitching now, as if she had words to say but couldn't. The crowd started muttering to themselves now. A cacophony of chatter swirled around Miss Elise's head. She was breathing intensely. Emily and her classmates who had skated up behind her were now staring at her. Miss Elise turned and bolted, shoving people aside as she made her way to the path that led to the park. It was slick, but mostly trampled down by all of the people in attendance at the jamboree. Tabitha's father stared blankly at the running woman for a moment, and then took off after her. She ran down the path, pines and lights blurring past. Tabitha's father called out, "What do you know? Tell me!" Miss Elise just kept running. He was gaining on her, and they reached the end of the path. Miss Elise was frantic. She started running through the park, towards the street. The bend in the road Emily had crossed some days ago, sneaking out of her house, was just ahead. Tabitha's father was even closer behind now. "Miss Elise, stop!" She turned as she reached the sidewalk and looked back to see how close he was. Then she tripped, and her body flung forward into the street. The snowplow truck that was passing by didn't have time to engage the brakes. For the most part, the road was clear. He was just out, sprinkling salt. The plow was raised several inches off the ground. That gap is where Miss Elise's head landed. Blood splattered onto Tabitha's father as he watched the woman's head grind to a pulp in front of him. The truck tires jolted as her body was flattened beneath them. That night, the police chipped away at the pond. The Christmas Jamboree coordinators left the lights on for them. They skimmed the entire bottom and found Tabitha by its far edge, wrapped in several strings of Christmas lights and weighed down. Forensic evidence from the dance studio and Miss Elise's trunk confirmed Emily's accusations. Emily told her parents and the police the truth. She knew the police didn't believe it, but she hoped her parents did. Keisha knew the truth, and when she heard people talking about it at school, she defended Emily every time. Emily entertained the first few people who asked about it, but as the days went on, everyone knew the details and she didn't feel like repeating them. Now, when people asked about it, she simply replied, "People don't just disappear." Thank you so much for listening to this short story. Writing has really kept my head screwed on this holiday season. It's been an immense therapy for me. If you enjoyed this story, consider giving Strange Whispers a rating or a review on whatever streaming platform you're listening on. I also have a Patreon at patreon.com/strangewhispers. That link will also be in the show notes. However you choose to support, I cannot thank you enough. Remember that you are not alone during the holiday season or any season. I'll see all of you on the next story. Until then, keep creating.